Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Casual Audio Papers. Yesterday, or however many days it was ago, I was talking about Derrick Bell. That's this gentleman right here. And I was talking about the entrance convergence theory, which is what Derrick Bell advocated for. And in the theory, he talks primarily about how white people won't lift up black people unless it's generally in the interest of white people, which I took issue with, of course, because, one, that's historically not accurate in terms of the broad scheme of history. Yeah, it may have been that oftentimes that did happen, but there are plenty of instances in history, particularly Britain, as well as the North America, that went almost directly against their own interests in order to free slaves and lift up minority populations around the world, where they wouldn't even, first of all, there were economic issues with that. They didn't have any economic interest in doing so. Second of all, the people that they were freeing would likely not have appreciated it, and the people they were freeing them from would not have appreciated it. They suffered casualties, wars, and a variety of just negative impacts to their own nations. But it was a mission and a principle to these British people and to the Northerners in the United States that this was a matter of justice and not a matter of utilitarianism. So, there are a bunch of things like that. One thing in the last episode is, these are not scripted. Sometimes I don't even read the full article. Sometimes I don't even have my thoughts fully thought out before I read the article. I'm doing this partially to learn myself and because I think it's a cool idea. And yeah, so in the last episode, I sort of stumped myself halfway through, and I think that it was great because I was able to learn something a little bit and then also sort of put together my own thoughts. Of course, I was also really tired. I think you can tell in my voice. But anyway, I was talking about Derrick Bell, and this is something I didn't know. A lot of this stuff I'm looking at entirely from a fresh lens because I didn't know about this, what he did at Harvard. And I didn't know that he was dead, for instance. That was one thing. I was wondering, why are all his papers from a decade or so ago? But apparently it's because he died. And so I was just reading this, and I thought it was interesting. It summarizes his general work, philosophy, and all of that. Again, he was a legal scholar, and law is not an empirical study. It is an ethical study. And so if you have a particular ethical framework, then that's going to determine your legal framework as well, because law has to do with ethics, it has to do with justice, it has to do with punishments, retribution, and what is the proper way to order a society, which is why this, critical race theory in general, being a legal theory, is about the proper ordering of society, and it must move forward in ordering that society because it's a legal theory and it's not a scientific theory. But the danger there is it's not empirically based. Like we were talking last time, that a lot of the stuff that Derrick Bell brings up are just sort of assertions. And he makes the assertion and then, based on that assumption, says, therefore we know X. And it's like, but we don't know X. You made the claim, but you haven't tested the claim. So we're actually, this article is really interesting. So I'll read it, and it'll be, I think, informative for how the general theory, the general critical race theory, and the proponents of it, and just that general wing of politics, how they view things, and will try, like, they have merit. I'm like, don't get me wrong, I think there is merit to some of the things that they say. I think their conclusions are wrong to some, like, some of their conclusions are wrong. Some of them are very good and true. And and I think this article talks a bit about that. And so this is obituary, a eulogy, whatever the proper term is. It was in October. It was on October 6th, 2011, and the title is Derrick Bell, law professor and rights advocate, dies at 80, by Fred A. Bernstein. So with that, I actually have to do something really quick, but I'll be right back. Okay. Derrick Bell, a legal scholar who saw persistent racism in America and sought to expose it through books, articles, and provocative career moves. He gave up a Harvard Law School professorship to protest the school's hiring practices. Died on Wednesday in Manhattan. He was 80 and lived on the Upper West Side. The cause was carcinoid cancer. His wife, Janet Dewart Bell, said, Mr. Bell was the first tenured black professor at Harvard Law School, and later one of the first black deans of a law school that was not historically black. But he was perhaps better known for resigning from prestigious jobs than for accepting them. While he was working at the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department in his 20s, his superiors told him to give up his membership in the NAACP, believing it posed a conflict of interest. Instead, he quit the department, ignoring the advice of friends to try to change it from within. 30 years later, when he left Harvard Law School, he rejected similar advice. At the time, he said, his first wife, Jewel Hairston Bell, had asked him, quote, "Why does it always have to be you?" End quote. The question trailed him afterward. He wrote in a 2002 memoir, Ethical Ambitions. As did another posed by unsympathetic colleagues, quote, "Who do you think you are?" End quote. Professor Bell, soft-spoken and erudite, was non-confrontational by nature, he wrote, but he attacked both conservative and liberal beliefs. In 1992, he told the New York Times that Black Americans were more subjugated than at any time since slavery, and he wrote that in light of the often violent struggle that resulted from the Supreme Court's 1954 desegregation decision, Brown v. Board of Education, things might have worked out better if the court had instead ordered that both races be provided with truly equivalent schools. Now, the reason I think that this was really interesting, he not only did he resign from this Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department in his 20s, but he left Harvard Law School for similar, well, not similar reasons. The Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department gave him an ultimatum, and Harvard Law School, he, I guess, gave them an ultimatum. So there's a bit of a difference in the actors there. But I do like the idea that he's putting his own neck on the line. I find that to be actually pretty interesting, and I don't know. It's a bit. I'm a bit ambivalent to that because on the one hand, yeah, he is putting his neck on the line. He's putting his money where his mouth is. On the other hand, it seems just odd. Like, why is that what you're doing? it's and then maybe I just don't know what was going on at Harvard Law School at the time, but obviously he was there, and he was the first tenured black professor there, and so it's not like they were trying to. Well, I can't really say that they were not trying to, but just based on this article, the evidence that they were trying to keep black people down and not like looking for or not open to black people being like president or tenured professors or whatever just seems like a stretch. It seems like he has some sort of ideal in his mind, and other people, he's disappointed with other people, so therefore he has to quit or something along those lines. It's very black and white thinking, and I don't think it is evidence of a particularly nuanced mind. But, you know, I didn't know him, so I could be wrong about that. Whoops. I had to take out my shepherd's pie for a second. So, back to what we were talking about. Where was I? Oh, wait. Okay, we had ended right here. So right here, what he talks about, the things might have worked out better if the court had instead ordered that both races be provided with truly equivalent schools. I think it's really interesting because on the one hand, a lot of people in the critical race theory movement, or just on that side of things, they're like, the whole separate but equal thing was a lie, because if they're separate, then they will never truly be equal. Like, they accepted that part of the whole Brown v. Board of Education argument. But when it comes to actual integration, they're like, no, that won't work because people separate themselves already, right? So he's like, the racism is still there because the whole separate but equal, or because the whole integration side of things doesn't go far enough. It doesn't force people into particular schools like white people. They just move, and so they end up being segregated anyway, which is a bad thing. But then they say, therefore we need to have segregation. It would be better to have segregation if we truly made the schools equivalent. And I don't know, it seems like how would you describe it? It seems like it's just they're not happy with anything. It seems contradictory. It seems like they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. Like, on the one hand, it's racist if we segregate. On the other hand, it's racist if we don't. I think they're just looking for racism. Now, I don't think Derrick Bell actually... He was somebody who lived through a lot of that era, and it definitely paints the picture of the diversity of opinions in the civil rights advocacy group. But I think this particular issue, this segregation issue, and the idea that from the critical race theorists that segregation is better than what we have today, because today is basically segregation, is like, I just don't get it. It seems self-contradictory. So I don't know. He was a pioneer of critical race theory, a body of legal scholarship that explored how racism is embedded in laws and legal institutions, even many of those intended to redress past injustices. His 1973 book, Race, Racism, and American Law, became a staple in law schools and is now in its 6th edition. Mr. Bell, quote, set the agenda in many ways for scholarship on race in the academy, not just the legal academy, end quote, said Lonnie Guinier, the first black woman hired to join Harvard Law School's tenured faculty, in an interview on Wednesday of October 2011. At a rally while a student at Harvard Law, Barack Obama compared Professor Bell to the civil rights hero Rosa Parks, and that I think it makes sense, because Rosa Parks, of course, as everyone knows, she was protesting the blacks in the back of the bus sort of policy that a lot of southern bus routes had. And so what she did was she sat in the front of the bus. She wanted actually, no, that's the opposite. It would be, no, they did do this. So Rosa Parks was part of the effort, but if I remember right, there were lots of black people who just didn't, like, they protested the bus system in general, which actually, the Rosa Parks thing was sort of like a poster child, or, it was like a hallmark image for the movement to spread awareness to the rest of the country about what is going on. And then so that was sort of like the propaganda, propaganda in the technical definition. It was the push of imagery for a particular political cause. That was that side of things. But then you also had the economic side of things, where black people just decided to walk if they didn't receive equal opportunity to go into the front or the back of the bus, whatever area that they chose. And so I suppose the issue with Derrick Bell was there are not enough tenured professors, like black tenured professors at Harvard. So therefore, I'm not going to be a tenured professor at Harvard anymore. And so it's sort of like, not necessarily like Rosa Parks in a one-to-one sort of comparison, but it was like that movement, and that makes a lot of sense, in my opinion. It was just, Professor Bell's core beliefs included what he called the interest convergence dilemma, which is what we talked about in the last episode. The idea that whites would not support efforts to improve the position of blacks unless it was in their interest. Asked how the status of blacks could be... Okay, so if that's actually how it's articulated, then that's just wrong for reasons that I mentioned above. I think what you have to do in order to come to that conclusion is you have to sort of paint whites as one broad category, which is just not true. White people are not one broad category, and especially in the way that critical race theorists define whites as being not people of white skin, but they are the people of power. And, there's basically there's a long list of reasons for that I won't get into, but basically how critical race theorists view race is there are two races. There's the people in power and the people who are not in power, and white people are the ones in power, and people of color are the ones not in power. But white is not defined as white-skinned or Anglo-Saxon or heritage or history or anything like that, although it strongly correlates with those things today. But white people are defined as those in power in a particular society, which is it's one of those things where it's like that's the definition, but nobody knows that. And so therefore, when you talk about white people in the critical race theory area, it's highly muddled and confused. Okay, so at one point it's talking specifically about those in power and only about those in power, but at another point it's just sort of assumed, it goes hand in hand with that the people in power are the white people, the people with Anglo-Saxon or some other roots and stuff. And actually there's this one article in the critical race theory book that I got called Whiteness as Property. And what it talks about is whiteness being more of a privileged position or a powerful position that certain people have, that they can sell, lend, allow other people to borrow, or they can borrow, and all that sort of stuff. Whiteness is seen as like some sort of private property that you can give to other people. And the idea around that is you have certain groups of people that at one point were not white. They were people of color. Let's say Jewish people, or let's say Asian people, or let's say Mexicans, or even certain like Kenyans, for instance. Now, those people, their baseline position is the people of color position. Like, we're talking about the context of the United States. They come into the United States entirely powerless. Historically speaking, this is true. So they come into the United States, and then as they befriend white people and they continue to gain in status or whatever, white people sort of give them whiteness. They are bestowed the hand of friendship by white people and the acceptance of white people into the ranks of the privileged position. And so that's why you can say that Asian people, they're not white, because you can't say that because critical race theory is highly confused. But you can't say Asian people are white. You can't say Jewish people are white, even though some people do. And you can't say certain groups of people are white because it's confused. They're obviously not white in the way that in the popular way people see it, but they are considered white in the academic sense, which is why you get the term white adjacent, which is pretty much just as bad as being white. And so you get those people, and that includes Kenyans. That includes people who were not historically slaves. It even includes people who were historically slaves that then became powerful, and sort of powerful within the system that white people created, and that sort of thing. And so when you talk about the idea that whites would not support efforts to improve the position of blacks unless it was in their interest, it's a confused statement because there's so much jargon in there that you just read it and you're like, okay, I guess, but it's obviously not true if you know anything about history. But it's less talking about race and more talking about class. And so the upper class would not support efforts to improve the position of lower class people unless it was in their interest. And even that, I think, is just wrong, historically speaking. But it's not like all wrong. It's not entirely wrong. Upper class people, let's say, I don't know the exact proportion, but let's say it's a 70-30 proportion. 70% of upper class people want to improve the lot of the lower class people just as such. They don't really care if it is in their interest. What they only care about is they don't want to do it to their own detriment. And then let's say 30% of people will only do it, of upper class people will only do it if it's in their best interest to do so. I think I might be a little conservative with that estimate, but I think that's generally what you could say. Now, the claim is the upper class just does not want to improve the position of the lower class unless it was in their interest. But that's just not true. Now, you could get around that. You could say, well, the upper class people who want to do it in a more altruistic way still want to feel good about it. So they do it, and then they feel good about it, so therefore they're serving themselves. But if that's the case, if that's how you're describing it, then what you're doing is you have a conclusion seeking evidence. And that makes it a non-scientific position. It makes it an irrefutable position. And therefore, if you try to discuss the issue on its merits, it's irrefutable. It cannot be overthrown, which means it is scientifically speaking, wrong. It's not true. And especially because the evidence is not, it's not in favor of that proposition. Like if we're talking about racially, white people do support the efforts to improve the position of black people, despite their interests. In many instances, I mean, there are plenty of cases in history, and then like you have George Washington, you have Thomas Jefferson, you have Benjamin Franklin, you have John Woolman, you have what was his name, William Penn, you have Aristotle, you have like just a series of people. There's always people in every era wanting to improve the position of the racial minority in their groups. And then even more evidenced by the historical facts is that you have a high proportion of people in the upper class who want to lift up the poor people, the lower class people, just because. Now, it's not to say that everyone, and that's not to say the most powerful people have wanted that, but it is to say that if you were to divide it between like a binary upper and lower class of people, or a binary white and people of color people, that there is a high proportion of all of those people who really actually want what's best for the lower class people. And that's also not to say that people are generally good, because I don't think that they are, but it is to say that this claim is wrong. It's just wrong. And then, of course, what we talked about last time is that interest convergence is not wrong. It's not bad. If you're doing something that benefits another person and also what is in your best interest, or at least it's a good interest, it's something that benefits you, that's called a win-win situation in business. You both win, and you grow the pie. It's just called good business. So I mean, if you are talking from a legal standpoint, and you look at a group of people, and they think that it's in their interest to lift up another group of people, and it's in both of their interests, and you find out that that's a win-win, and you combat that, then you're telling groups of people, businesses, everyone, that what is essentially economically, morally good is not good. So there's this trend, I guess, in academia, and it's a really insidious trend where you have people who are experts in one field deciding that they are experts in other fields. They have their particular position, but they think that they also know one or two things about another area when they really don't. You have scientists going into or making decisions that economists should be making, or that theologians should be making, or that journalists should be making. And that's a real problem today. You have lawyers deciding what religion advocates should be making, deciding things that theologians and religious advocates should be making, or that scientists should be making, and all that sort of stuff. One of the big issues in our society is, on the one hand, the highly specialized nature of each of our sort of disciplines, the lack of interdisciplinary efforts, but also the failure of those people who are not making an effort to be interdisciplinary to think that they are interdisciplinary. And so it's one of those things that I've studied business, I've studied psychology, I've studied religion, I studied engineering, and you see a very a wide difference between the artists, the engineers, the scientists, the theologians, and the economists. And they're all in their own niche, and they all think that they know what's best for the world, and that's wrong. And I think Derrick Bell and the critical race theologians are one of those are some of those sorts of people. They're taking what is essentially a legal theory and saying that it gives us the overarching world narrative, at least as it relates to the United States. And therefore it should be the deciding factor when it comes to scientific decisions, religious decisions, economic decisions, all of these areas that law is subservient to. It is not domineering in. Like, law has to be subservient to economics. It has to be subservient to religion, like by definition. And it has to be subservient to science. But for some reason, the tables have been flipped, and law has become the master. And it's really bad. And I was talking about last time about just the severe lack of good scholarship, at least in the paper that I was reading. And I think that is the result of this sort of flipping. But I've gone on a bit too long about this. The interest convergence dilemma, I don't think is a dilemma. I think it's a good business move. And I think the way that it's articulated by Derrick Bell is just wrong. Interest convergence, if we are to amend it, means it is the idea that somebody lifts up another person when it's also in their interest to do so. It's not the only way to go about it, but it is a good way to get a lot of people on board. If you tell the Southerners, and you prove to Southerners that it would be good for them to give up their slaves for whatever reason, like it's economically good, it's politically good, it's part of the Bible, it's whatever, to give up your slaves, and it's just going to be beneficial to you, then you have they did do that actually, and what you had was a bunch of Southerners saying no, despite the fact that it would be good for us. But let's say all of that proof is given to them, and they say that's true, we should give up our slaves. Also, it's ethical. And then you say that they are evil just because they would only do it if it's in their best interest. Now you could say it's not ideal. Maybe you could build the case that it's evil, but something good happened. And that's the point. Now, to amend my previous statement, the interest convergence dilemma as articulated in that way, of course, is not like the highest good. But it's a win-win. It's a good. I do think altruism is probably the highest good, and you see plenty of evidence of European nations doing that. Like, one of the major reasons for colonization, among other things, was to free slaves from around the world. You also had an idea where they were going and saying, well, I don't know. You have a couple nations where they colonize for their own interests. Mexico, that area, India, the Silk Road area, all those areas. But oftentimes they would colonize a place to free slaves. And that's not something that you're taught when you have a small, closed-minded view of history, where you think that your two-part theory of race relations explains everything about Western history. Interest convergence explains a little bit, but it doesn't explain everything. And that's one of the major important points that I want to get through when it comes to, let's say, stuff that we're talking about when we talk about critical race theory. Okay, I'm going to continue. Asked how the status of blacks could be improved, he said he generally supported civil rights litigation, but cautioned that even favorable rulings would probably yield disappointing results, and that it was best to be prepared for that. Which is true. I said last time that we're talking about, in all of these areas of life, we're talking about incremental, step-by-step improvement towards a particular ideal. That's actually really important, because if you have a particular ideal in your mind, you could be wrong. So if, let's say, you implement all of that all at once, and you swing way too far past what is a just society, and you get to the opposite side of a just society, even though you think it's the right thing in your mind, and you move past justice. If you move past justice, you don't get super justice, you get another form of injustice. And that is probably one of the most important points about critical race theory, is that it is that sort of worldview. Much of Professor Bell's scholarship rejected dry legal analysis in favor of stories. In books and law review articles, he presented parables and allegories about race relations, then debated their meaning with a fictional alter ego, a professor named Geneva Crenshaw, who forced him to confront the truth about racism in America. Now, I actually like that. I think overly dry legal analysis is wrong. You need the stories aspect. You need the intuitive heart of ethical analysis to help you know where the area is that you build your mathematical fence around. But I think he primarily dealt in stories, which also is wrong, because he needed to have the facts on his side. One of his best-known parables is The Space Traders, which appears in his 1992 book, quote, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism, end quote. In the story, as Professor Bell later described it, creatures from another planet offer the United States enough gold to retire the national debt, a magic chemical that will cleanse America's polluted skies and waters, and a limitless source of safe energy to replace our dwindling reserves. In exchange, the creatures ask for only one thing: America's black population, which would be sent to outer space. The white population, in the story, accepts the offer by an overwhelming margin. In 1994, the story was adapted as one of 3 segments in a television movie entitled Cosmic Slop. So, wait. Let me get this straight in the story. In order to solve the world energy problem, America's energy problem, America's pollution problem, and America's debt problem, which would be a temporary fix, we would trade all of the black people in the United States, according to Derrick Bell. I don't think that's true. No, that doesn't feel right. It seems like a contrived story. Now, that's not to say, it's like one of those questions, how much money do I have to give you in order to kill somebody? Or how much money do I have to give you in order to go against one of your most fundamental moral principles? And for most people, you have a particular limit. Like, certain people, of course, have absolutely, like, they hold their moral values so strongly that they would just, no amount of money would be enough, especially those people who, like, don't need the money. But if you're in crisis and someone offers you a certain amount of money that will get you out of that crisis at the very least, and may even far exceed the crisis limit so that you can live comfortably, most people will have a certain level where they would waver on their principles. And we see this. I mean, we see in certain third world countries, women are selling their children into sex slavery, although they may be fooling themselves into thinking that that's not what it is. Men commit violence. Some of them rape women. Some of them do all this other sort of stuff. There's one story about this gang who is inducting a man, or a kid. He was like probably 19 or 20, into their gang, and they had like one final test. He had to participate in a gang rape of this hooded woman. She was naked, but she had a bag over her head. So he did all that. He really wanted to be part of this gang, and then they gave him a gun and told him to shoot her. So he did. He really wanted to be in this gang. Then they pull the bag off her head, and it turns out to be his mother. And, well, then they shoot him. The basic point is that people who have particular values in crisis will probably waver in them in order to solve the crisis to some degree. I don't think that like, I don't know what the statistics on that are, but you can imagine a world where that is the case, and I think it's not difficult to imagine that world. And that's pretty much what he's talking about now. The issue is it's one-sided. Like, do you think that, let's say, white people wouldn't sell half of white people to solve all those problems? Do you think Germans would not sell half of Britons? Like German Americans, half of British Americans, or Jewish Americans, half of Christian Americans, or Black Americans, half of white Americans, or whatever? All of that is true because that's human nature of morality in crisis. It's not some deep fundamental truth about race relations in America. It's a deep fundamental truth about, it's an obvious truth about human nature in general. So that's one of the issues with a lot of these critical race theorists. They take something that's just a basic human nature thing, and then they say only white people have this issue, and they only have this issue towards people of color. But it's not true. It's all people have this issue, and there are lots of groups of people outside of their own family that they would sell. They would probably sell a lot of their own family too. And so this is the point of stories in the absence of legal analysis. They're both important and necessary because when you analyze the story and look at the statistics and ask a bunch of white people, ask a bunch of black people, ask a bunch of people this question and give them a variety of groups, there like there may be a higher likelihood when they're talking about outgroup members that they would give them to the aliens. But this is just, it's silly. It's a silly argument. Not everyone welcomed the move to storytelling in legal scholarship. In 1997, Richard Posner, the conservative law professor and appeals court judge, wrote in The New Republic that, by repudiating reasoned argumentation, scholars like Professor Bell reinforce stereotypes about the intellectual capacities of non-whites. I don't know if it did. It definitely says something about the intellectual capacities of critical race theorists, that's for sure. But I don't think there's any sort of necessary correlation with non-white people. But of course, that's in 1997. I don't know what they were like, the culture was like back then. Professor Bell's narrative technique nonetheless became an accepted mode of legal scholarship, giving female, Latino, and gay scholars a new way to introduce their experiences into legal discourse. Reviewing Faces at the Bottom of the Well in the New York Times, the Supreme Court reporter Linda Greenhouse wrote, "The stories challenge old assumptions and then linger in the mind in a way that a more conventionally scholarly treatment of the same themes would be unlikely to do." Right, because syllogisms don't linger in the mind as much as a story does. But you can use the same type of storytelling to challenge critical race theory. And I think that's the issue. It's just a good practice to be able to tell stories and make these legal analyses pungent. Pungent. That's how you pronounce that word. For the readers, and to paint a picture to the intuitive mind about how a particular law or a particular policy affects people. But it has to be one that's based on fact. It can't just be a made-up story, and that's the issue. Derrick Albert Bell, Jr. was born on November 6, 1930, in Pittsburgh, to Derrick Albert and Ada Elizabeth Childress Bell. After graduating from Schenley High School near Pittsburgh's Hill District, he became the first member of his family to go to college, attending Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. He received his bachelor's degree in 1952. A member of the ROTC at Duquesne, he was later an Air Force officer for 2 years, one of them in Korea. Afterwards, he attended the University of Pittsburgh Law School, where he was the only black student, earning his degree in 1957. After his stint at the Justice Department, he headed the Pittsburgh office of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, leading efforts to integrate a public swimming pool and a skating rink. Later assigned to Mississippi, he supervised more than 300 school desegregation cases. In 1969, after teaching briefly at the University of Southern California, he was recruited and hired by Harvard Law School, where students were pressuring the administration to appoint a black professor. Mr. Bell conceded that he did not have the usual qualifications for a Harvard professorship, like a federal court clerkship or a degree from a top law school. In 1980, he left Harvard to become Dean of the University of Oregon School of Law, but he resigned in 1985 when the school did not offer a position to an Asian American woman. After returning to Harvard in 1986, he staged a 5-day sit-in in his office to protest the school's failure to grant tenure to 2 professors whose work involved critical race theory. I don't know why. I mean, it's fantastic scholarship. In 1990, he took an unpaid leave of absence, vowing not to return until the school hired, for the first time, a black woman to join its tenured faculty. His employment effectively ended when the school refused to extend his leave. By then, he was teaching at New York University School of Law, where he remained a visiting professor until his death. Harvard Law School hired Professor Guinier in 1998. Mr. Bell said his personal decisions took a toll on his first wife, Jewel, who had cancer when he left Harvard in 1990 and died that year. In 1992, he began a correspondence with Jeanette Duart, who was the communications director of the National Urban League. Ms. Duart proposed marriage before the couple even met. A few months later, Mr. Bell accepted. In addition to his wife, he is survived by 3 sons from his first marriage, Derrick A. Bell III, Douglas Dubois Bell, both of Pittsburgh, and Carter Robeson Bell of New York. 2 sisters, Jeanette Bell of Pittsburgh and Constance Bell of Akron, Ohio, and a brother, Charles, of New York. In Ethical Ambition, Mr. Bell expressed doubts about his legacy. It is not easy to look back over a long career and recognize with some pain that my efforts may have benefited my career more clearly than they helped those for whom I have worked. That's always a difficult one to sometimes I think about, because I'm at the beginning of any potential career in scholarship. And so one of the issues that I have is, will I be able to have any sort of impact? And I know that's a particularly millennial approach to it. Not that that's bad, but it's working as part of a larger movement, as a faceless part of a larger movement, is something that previous generations had a lot more not reticence. They had a lot more resignation about, and maybe they found meaning in it a lot more too. But as a millennial, it's a little more difficult to find that. But I think that it's probably a virtue that I don't possess, that I need to work in myself. But I think one of the best ways to put yourself in the best possible position is to seek and hold on to truth as much as you can. And then if you hold on to any sort of lasting truth, then even if you're not named in history, at least you would have participated in the propagation of a lasting truth and a lasting work. So I have sympathy for Mr. Bell, at least in that respect. And I don't want to criticize him into oblivion. I think his work has done a good amount to bring legal scholarship back into the realm of storytelling, but it can't stay only in the realm of storytelling. You have to have both analysis and storytelling. Otherwise, well, what's law at that point? A bunch of people just deciding that they are the law regardless because they heard a story one time and it feels right to them. That's unfortunately the current state of many of the states in the Union today, but it's wrong. We need both analysis and storytelling. But Professor Guinier, who continues to teach at Harvard, differed with that view. Most people think of iconoclasts as lone rangers, she said on Wednesday. But Derrick was both an iconoclast and a community builder. When he was opening up this path, it was not just for him. It was for all those who he knew would follow into the legal academy. And that's the end of the article. There are a couple corrections. Correction October 6, 2011, the next day after the article was published. It says, an earlier version misstated the surname of Mr. Bell's wife. She is Jeanette Duart Bell, not Duart. This article, and then there's one more correction. On the 11th of the same month, an obituary on Friday about Derrick Bell, the legal scholar and civil rights advocate, erroneously attributed a distinction to him. He was one of the first black deans of a law school that was not historically black. He was not the first. So, I don't know enough about Derrick Bell or like the personas within the critical race movement. I know he's one of the pioneers of critical race theory. But I also think critical race theory is doomed to fail, unfortunately. It's and the reason I think that isn't just because I think it's wrong, but it is a mutation of critical theory, which failed because it wasn't true and because it like people just didn't believe it because it wasn't true, but it didn't explain anything about the world. It made assertions and people looked around them and some of them believed it, but then as people looked around them, they're like, no, it's not true. It doesn't feel right. And so the amount of people who believed it didn't reach any critical mass. And it's the same thing with critical race theory. The fact that it's a mutation of critical theory, but the essential components have not really changed, means that another mutation is going to come. There's going to be another super critical race theory or whatever, and critical race theory is going to be forgotten just like critical theory is, except for those people who care to study it. And then give it a few hundred years, and it'll fall by the wayside. Like, who here learns about mercantilism, for instance? One of the precursors of Marxism, and then critical theory, and then critical race theory. I don't think anybody does. A lot of people will say that if you ask them the tenets of mercantilism, they'll say that sounds right. But nobody looks at mercantilism and then looks at the scholars that proposed and founded mercantilism, and then people just that's not a thing. And that was just a few hundred years ago. It's going to be the same with critical race theory, unfortunately. And if I could participate in its destruction, I will gladly do so. Okay. Wow, I dragged that on. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I just hope you have a good day. If you have any questions, comments, or any other articles that on the topic that you think would be beneficial for me to read, then let me know. Bye.